and I welcome you to the new lecture on EU-Russian relations. And we talk today about the European Union, and more specifically about ideas that shape external activities of the European Union. Yeah? I just remind you that previously we covered the additional part of Russia and Russian foreign policy and the institutional part of Russian foreign policy. So we move to the block of the European Union, starting with ideas and then moving to institutions. So ideas. Well, firstly, I should say that as everywhere, history is important. The EU has always been a project of economic reconstruction and enhanced economic development. But the European Union has also always been a project of peace building. This is how European integration started. Remember that the idea was not economic initially. Oh, it was half economic and half political, because the idea was to actually bring eternal peace to the peoples and to the states of Europe. Yeah? So economic integration and political goal of peace building were two goals running in parallel. And this is essential to understand the additional part of the European Union, because economy has always been in the center of the process, but it has not necessarily always been the end goal of the process, because the end goal of the process has always been political, be it peace building or enhancing democracy and the rule of law. The European Union is also a work in progress and has always been a work in progress, yes? And therefore we see gradual enlargement of the European Union, starting with 6 member states, achieving 28 member states, and hopefully keeping 28 member states. We still have to see what will happen to Britain. The European Union has always been in the process of deepening of the integration. Yeah? So integration going deeper and deeper, sort of like involving more and more fields. And we see complex structures within the European Union, and we see a very intricate division of competences between member states and the European Union as a bloc. Here's the map of the European Union of 28 member states. Yeah, so this is the state of the enlargement that the European Union has reached by now. And this is a very schematic and the most conventional way of presenting how European integration deepened from a free trade area, a step which was actually jumped over by the European Union, which the European Union, all the European communities jumped over, starting with the Customs Union in 1968, declaring the internal market complete in 1992, and constructing the economic and monetary union. The internal market and the economic and monetary union are still in the process of the construction. And then, of course, there is a question of where political integration fits in. And sometimes people say that political integration follows economic and monetary union. But in fact, political integration accompanies economic integration, every stage of the economic integration. Because every time you integrate economically, you renounce a part of the sovereignty. Think about the customs union. Yes, it's mainly about trade. It's mainly about custom barriers. It's mainly about unifying, sort of like harmonizing custom barriers, custom duties. But at the same time, think about sanctions. Sanctions are a way to use economic tools for the political purpose. And therefore, if you integrate common external if you integrate trade policy into a common external policy, common trade policy, then you actually have to agree on some political goals, foreign policy goals as well. And this is what happened in the 1970s with the European political cooperation. Same goes for the internal market. Same indisputably goes for the economic and monetary union. So political integration, in fact, accompanies economic integration. It's a parallel process, but the fact that political integration frequently lags behind leads to a number of crises. Okay, so now let's look at the economic part of the EU's external relations, at the ideas that surround it, at how we can use economic power to pursue not only economic goals, but also political goals. The European Union gradually became a very attractive partner, trade partner, because it's a huge trade bloc yeah, including more than 500 million people, with a huge GDP per capita. Yeah, I have an average GDP per capita of 25,000 euro in the slide. It evolves, but this is an approximate figure. It's the largest trade bloc. They use internal policies, in fact, influence the rest of the world, be it competition policy, environmental policy, fishery policy, agricultural policy, any policy, in fact, influences the rest of the world, precisely because the European Union is such a big trade power and has many links with the rest of the world. The European Union accounts for about 30% of the global trade. It's huge, and this is another reason why it is such an attractive trade partner. The European Union has trade agreements with virtually all countries around the world. They range from simple trade agreements, that's the most simplistic form, all the way to EU membership. And there are many forms in between, like cooperation agreement, like the partnership and cooperation agreement, which is inter alia concluded with Russia, like an association agreement or the Europe agreement, Europe agreement. Yeah, so this is what the European Union concludes with candidate countries or with neighborhood countries. And of course there is the European Economic Area, which actually puts in place free circulation of 4 freedoms between the European Union and members of the European Economic Area. So hierarchy of trade agreements establishing all types of relations with the European Union. Economy is the essence of the EU's activities in today's world. It's an important trade partner, yeah? But countries frequently compete for the EU's economic assistance as well, because the European Union is the biggest donor of development aid in the world. But the European Union very quickly realized that it could actually use its economic power not only for the sake of economic power, but also for the sake of political power. And this is how the concept of civilian power was born. François Duchesne introduced it, and then it was later developed. The idea behind is that the European Union can use economic power to pursue not only economic goals, but also political goals, enhancing democracy and the rule of law. Yeah, so enhancing sort of like the support for what we call Western norms around the world. The European Union also believes that it can spread its economic experience throughout the world, and it believes in the potential of integration. It tries to encourage integration throughout the world, with possibly one exception, and this is the Eurasian exception, or the exception in the Eurasian space, where integration projects which involve Russia are severely doubted by the European Union. The European Union also sponsors transformation throughout neighbors, yeah, in the area around it, either through the prospect of enlargement, and enlargement is probably the most influential, yeah, the strongest policy of the European Union, strongest external policy of the European Union, but it's of course limited in terms of the scope. The European Union also insists on legal approximation and on trade liberalization, visa liberalization with its neighbors, but the neighborhood policy is less effective precisely because there is no big carrot in the form of becoming members of the European Union. Linked to the civilian power is the concept of political conditionality. Civilian power is an instrument, is a theory, is a concept, is an academic concept. Political conditionality is something that the European Union uses in its official speeches. Political conditionality is about conditioning economic assistance or trade privileges with some sorts of political requirements, like democratic reforms, like respect for human rights and the rule of law. It is an important factor of the EU's policy. It has become an important It has become an important factor of the EU's policy since late 1970s, and throughout the 1980s and 1990s the importance grew until the link between politics and economics was made in the Maastricht Treaty. The European Union, in fact, now includes references to values in virtually all agreements with external partners. And political conditionality can be ex ante or ex post. Yeah? So you can actually put conditions, yeah, before you liberalize trade or increase assistance. Or vice versa, you can increase assistance and grant trade privileges to encourage partners to respect human rights, the rule of law, and democracy. Political conditionality can be negative or it can be positive. You can punish for something that you don't like normatively, or you can reward a partner for a good behavior. And it is believed that positive political conditionality, yeah, and ex ante political conditionality challenge the sovereignty of EU partners less, and that's why they're preferable. The legitimacy of the political conditionality is frequently questioned, but the European Union says that it is about widely accepted norms, it is about multilateral interference, and therefore these are legitimate. Yeah? So norms and political conditionality is legitimate. But then, of course, it is always about some interference in domestic affairs, in internal affairs of a partner country, and it is frequently imposed from outside, which is problematic for values. Political conditionality, therefore, is criticized. It is criticized because the European Union unevenly applies it to various partners. The European Union is often accused of lacking its own initiative and rather following international organizations in what it does. Another problem is that it's not always clear how to relaunch the relations if you impose some sort of economic restraints but nothing changes. Now you have to continue the dialogue, but it's not clear how. No? And of course, if you reduce economic transactions, there is no leverage to influence the other side, which is also problematic. Political conditionality is also frequently criticized because it doesn't address the roots of disrespect for human rights and democracy, and it also provokes violence. Frequently, the results of political conditionality, the results of the fact that you decrease economic assistance or decrease the amount of trade privileges, frequently that influences the most vulnerable parts of the population, whereas the rulers who are actually responsible for the violation of human rights or democracy live in luxury and do not have any constraints. So there are many reasons why political conditionality is criticized, but then of course politics is the art of possible, and you have to influence somehow countries that you don't like, and these are the instruments that the European Union has. There are some technical difficulties as well in terms of the compartmentalization of the EU's policies sometimes, when assistance is granted by one DG, whereas trade policy is granted by another DG, is shaped by another DG of the European Commission, and politics is decided by the European External Action Service. So compartmentalization of the EU's policy is an issue. It is always difficult to achieve a consensus among member states, and of course the European Union, as many political actors, are now fond of quantifiable indicators, and therefore human rights are frequently reduced to democracy, and democracy is frequently reduced to free elections. Because free elections are fairly easy to measure, but you cannot actually measure democracy only with the help of free elections, and you cannot measure the respect for human rights only with the help of democracy. So therefore, the way the European Union measures all these things is a question of debate as well. And of course, the European Union frequently prefers the carrot over a stick, because a carrot is more acceptable, yeah, than a stick. It sounds less punitive. Yeah? It sounds less like an interference in internal affairs, and this is how the European Union prefers it. So that's about economic tools and the usage of economic tools for political purpose. But of course, the European Union is also a political and military power, and this is the next part of our lecture. Because, and before I start explaining it, I have to say that, of course, political and military power is much less pronounced in the European Union compared to economic power. It's mainly due to the fact that it emerged much later. It is also something that goes to the core of the sovereignty of member states, and therefore they're less willing to, in fact, give the European Union the right to interfere in it. And therefore, we speak mostly about intergovernmental coordination in this field. But the European Union does have common foreign and security policy. It was established in Maastricht Treaty. And of course, the European Union has political dialogues with virtually every country throughout the world. The European Union also builds European security and defense policy. It's a work in progress. It's mostly about peacekeeping operations. The collective security and collective defense obligations are a possibility now, but that is a very recent phenomenon. It's a phenomenon which appeared in the Lisbon Treaty, and previously it was reserved to the NATO members. As of 2015, the European Union intensified debates about the European Army, and of course the Lisbon Treaty brought in a new term, which is common security and defense policy. Yeah, so it's more communitarized, it's more integrated than European security and defense policy, but it remains to be seen what will happen out of it. So why are political and military types of cooperation less efficient than economic cooperation? Well, I already mentioned that this is high politics, yeah? Something that goes to the core of member states' sovereignty, and therefore something that member states are not ready to renounce easily. Furthermore, there is a fairly weak institutionalization in this area, and mostly member states apply unanimity and not qualified majority voting. And unanimity means that you need to get on board all 28 member states, which basically results in the lowest common denominator. There's no common ground ideology. Well, we'll speak about values, which of course is presented as a common ground ideology, but it is still debated to the extent to which it can present an ideology is still a question of debates among experts. Most competences are still located at the national level, and member states do converge, member states do learn each other better, but there is still no full convergence in views, in values, in interests. There are still divergent expectations, divergent historical past, divergent historical traumas, and all of that affects the result. And of course, the European Union is frequently said that the European Union lacks external pressure, and therefore the lack of the external pressure means that the European Union doesn't go in the direction of common foreign policy, really common foreign policy, the way it could have gone if there was a threat, an external threat. The European Security Strategy of 2003 was the first effort of the European Union to, in fact, shape some sort of the ideology in the area of foreign policy. It was the result of the Iraq crisis, and more specifically, disagreement among member states about what was going in Iraq, whether it was essential to interfere there or not. It was also the result of the 2002 US strategy, the European Union felt the need to react to it. But then, of course, the European Union was at the height of its power, and there was this sort of like very well pronounced wish to carry the values of the European Union to the outside world. So the European Union proclaims terrorism, weapon of mass destruction, and failed states and organized crime new threats. But the European Union also says that there are reasons behind it. Of course, you can punish terrorists. Of course, you can seek to prevent the proliferation of the weapon of mass destruction. But there are reasons why that these phenomena emerge in the first place. And the reasons that the European Union quote are poverty, bad governance, climate change, the lack of access to energy and to water resources. And therefore the European Union says that we actually have to deal with the very reasons of the new threats, and not with the threats when they are fully fledged. So in a way, European security strategy was an effort to depart from the notion of civilian power, to do something more. But at the same time, the means and the logics stayed profoundly civilian. Recently, in 2016, the European Union adopted global strategy. And this is still the key document that sort of summarizes the logics, the values and the ideas of the European Union in the outside world. The European Union talks about existential crisis within and beyond the European Union. Inter alia, to the east, the European Union talks about the European security order being violated. It also talks about terrorism and violence that plague the North Africa and the Middle East. It talks about economic growth, insufficient economic growth, which yet has to outpace demographic crisis in Africa. It talks about security, challenges in Asia and climate change. And therefore the European Union tries to outline a vision which links internal security and external security of the European Union. It also talks a lot about resilience, about values, but also about something that is called principled pragmatism. And principled pragmatism is about promotion of values, but with some sort of a realist intention. Balancing between values and liberal approach and interest and realism approach. The European Union also talks about unity, about engagement and about partnership. 5 priorities are outlined in the EU's global strategy, and these are the security of the European Union and the resilience of EU democracies, and that includes resilience to cyber threats, to energy disruptions, to fake news, but also to terrorism. The European Union talks about state and societal resilience to the east and to the south. It talks about an integrated approach to conflicts, cooperative regional orders, and global governance in the 21st century based on international law and universal values. And the European Union, in fact, puts quite clearly that the key to the EU's global strategy is, of course, unity among member states, unity between the European Union and member states, and of course defense. If you compare the security strategy of 2003 with the EU's global strategy, then we'll see that there are a number of differences. First of all, the key differences in the EU's global strategy are on Russia, on the Middle East, on migration and defense. These are key issues of debates among member states at present. Secondly, the European Union quite clearly moves from transformation of its neighbors to a transactional approach, to a more pragmatic approach. But the value component is still firmly enrooted there. So we can still talk about defensive normative power, but normative power, but rather about a defensive normative power rather than an offensive normative power. The US also changed its status in the EU's global strategy from the only pole of the world order to the country core partner of the European Union. The European Union also emphasizes less effective multilateralism. The EU's global strategy is definitely longer than the security strategy of 2003 because the European Union argues that there are more threats, but also because there is less agreement among member states about the state in which the European Union is now in and about where to move afterwards. And of course, there are no strategic partners in the EU's global strategy, but there are core partners, the United States being one of them, the NATO and the United Nations are the two others. And there are partners with who the European Union can engage on various issues. The role of Russia is negligible in the EU's global strategy, precisely because there was so much controversy about it. And this allows us to move to the normative agenda. The normative agenda is a very important part of the EU's external affairs. Or to quote Jan Manners, who is the author of the Normative Power Europe concept, the central component of Normative Power Europe is that the European Union exists as being different from pre-existing political forms, and that this particular difference predisposes it to act in a normative way. The normative agenda has always been present in the integration of the European Union, starting from the very beginning when European countries in the Schuman Declaration sought to prevent any future conflict in Europe. In the 1970s, the European Union tried to define its identity and said that the specificity of its activity in Europe was about human rights, about democracy, and about the rule of law. The development of political cooperation has always run in parallel to the development of the normative agenda. And the current normative agenda of the European Union is very clearly formulated in Article 21. It's very detailed and basically outlines all normative goals that the European Union tries to pursue in its foreign policy. Normative power, which we frequently associate with normative agenda, is additional by its very nature. Remember that Normative Power Europe is the term invented by Jan Manners. Normative power involves normative justification rather than material incentives. Normative power is about the power over opinion, about the ideological power, but also about the power of example. Normative power is not necessarily, it's actually not about instruments of foreign policy. Normative power is about the ability to influence the others by your example, by the example of the European Union, but also about change in the partners through the example, rather than through some sort of instruments like in the case of soft power. Normative power is definitely long-term. Normative power presupposes both normative goals and normative means. And normative power is based on norms, but it's also about the ability to shape the norms and the conception of what is normal. So the European Union is very normative. The normative power Europe is frequently associated with the European Union, although when we speak about the practice of the European Union, there is frequently a confusion between the normative power, which cannot be used instrumentally, and soft power, which is rather an instrumental way of promoting values. Normative power Europe, of course, is criticized. Any concept is criticized, and normative power Europe is criticized extensively as well. Firstly, the European Union is criticized for its inability to always act on the basis of norms. There are bits and pieces when the European Union actually neglects the norms for the sake of interests. Member states frequently delegate normative agenda to the European Union and at the same time pursue a very interest-based policy at the national level. Another reason to criticize normative power is the fact that a cosmopolitan law is impossible, and therefore we have to be realistic. You cannot impose values from outside. Moreover, we cannot insist on the fact that everybody respects the same values. Furthermore, normative power Europe is not only about foreign policy behavior, it is also an instrument of self-identification for the European Union. So the goal is profoundly selfish, if you want, because it's something that helps the identity building process within the European Union. Normative power Europe definitely depends on the way, on the extent to which it is supported by the others, to which it is adhered by the others, to which the others, the partners of the European Union, adhere to it. Military means that the European Union uses sometimes challenge the notion of the normative power, precisely because normative power is not only about normative means, but also about normative instruments, and therefore there is a huge debate in the academia about whether military means, in fact, not challenge normative power Europe. And then, of course, the European Union is frequently criticized for the fact that it adopts a rather consequential approach to values internally, using values as a reference point, and a deontological approach to its partners, saying that whatever happens, they have to respect the values. So this is the critique of the normative power Europe in the European Union, but the normative power Europe is a very important concept for the European Union for its external affairs. Another concept that is worth mentioning here is the concept of resilience. The European Union didn't invent the concept of resilience, nor was it invented for the sake of the European Union, unlike the two previous concepts that I mentioned, the normative power Europe and civilian power Europe. Resilience as a concept emerged in environmental studies, then it was spread to development policy, to poverty reduction, to disaster prevention, and eventually to security thinking. In 2012, the European Union used the word resilience, the term resilience, for the first time in the Commission communication on food crisis and on how the European Union has to address them. And there the European Union defined resilience as the ability of an individual, a household, a community or country or a region to withstand, to adapt, and to quickly recover from stress and shocks. In 2013, the European Union developed principles of resilience, and the EU's global strategy made resilience one of its central categories. There are more than 40 mentioning of this term. The European Union talks about resilience inside the European Union and outside of the European Union, about resilience of states and societies, about resilience of its neighbors and of the neighbors of the neighbors. And the 2017 communication, of course, provided for further details of the concept of resilience. When we look at the concept of resilience, the way the European Union tries to interpret it and compare it with the theory of resilience that exists, there are three important features that have to be emphasized. Firstly, the European Union puts a huge emphasis on threats, whereas the theory of resilience is mostly about resources and less so about threats and risks. In that sense, the concept of resilience within the European Union is profoundly securitarized. It's more about securitization than about resilience. And of course, the threats that are emphasized, energy supplies, cyber threats, fake news, hybrid threats, terrorism, these are threats that are both internal and external for the European Union, and the majority of them originate from Russia, with the possible exception of terrorism. Resilience, if you look at the theory of resilience, is not normative. Resilience is about coherence in the community. Resilience is about governance techniques. And resilience is about the possibility to bounce back. But it's not about democracy, human rights, or the rule of law. In the case of the European Union, resilience becomes hugely normative. So we can actually argue that resilience is about an effort to maintain normative power of the European Union in the situation of crisis. And last but not least, the European Union is not very coherent in terms of whether resilience is about transformation or whether it's about stability. Both ideas are presented in the EU's global strategy and in the 2017 communication on resilience. And the compromise that the European Union adopted, or seems to have adopted, is that the resilience is more about transformation than about preserving the status quo. But in the case of the European Union, resilience, in the case of the internal processes in the European Union, resilience is more about stability. Whereas in the case of EU partners, it's more about transformation, which again is a way to preserve a very liberal approach to foreign policy and to the normative agenda. Lastly, I would like to mention the concept of legal approximation. Legal approximation or legal harmonization is a process of unilateral approximation of the legislation, rules and norms of EU partners to what is practiced in the European Union. Legal approximation has always been present in one form or another in the EU's external activities, but it became central following the 1992 project, following the completion of the internal market, because elimination of barriers and enforcement of the concept of four freedoms meant that partners of the European Union have to fulfill a number of preconditions before they enter the EU's market. And this is how legal approximation became very central to many external agreements of the European Union. Legal approximation is also based on the idea that EU's norms and rules are the best option for everybody. This is not necessarily the case because the European Union starts from a different point of regulation compared to many of its partners, but also because the norms of the European Union are about what is feasible for 28 member states in a given moment of time, and not necessarily about the best option. But still, the acquis or the norms of the European Union are rarely negotiated in terms of the substance. So the European Union and its member states can negotiate on the timetable of this acquis, on some temporary exceptions, but not on the substance. The closer the agreement between the European Union and its partners, the bigger is the insistence on legal approximation on the part of the counterparts of the European Union. Legal approximation can involve some sectors, or it can be holistic and involve all economic sectors, like in the case of the European Economic Area. Legal approximation can be legally binding or voluntary. It's voluntary on the part of the United States, for example, but this is because there is a certain degree of trust between the European Union and the United States. But in the case of candidate countries or neighboring countries, it's more of a legally binding character. Legal approximation can be dynamic, like in the case of the European Economic Area, when member states of the European Economic Area always adopt the new legislation of the European Union. Or it can be static, meaning that you achieve a certain level of legal approximation, then you need a new agreement to go further in the process of legal approximation with the European Union. But legal approximation is a very important additional part of the EU's external affairs, and it's a very important technical and instrumental part of EU's external relations. So if we summarize the additional part of the European Union, of external activities of the European Union, we will reach this sort of like slide and this type of conclusion. Firstly, we talk about the economic power of the European Union, about the market power, about citizens' wealth, about promotion of integration, and legal approximation comes very closely with it. Secondly, we speak about the civilian power and political conditionality, about the ability of the European Union to use economic tools for the sake of political goals. The European Union is a very weak security player, but it does do a lot in terms of peacekeeping operations. The European Union promotes a set of normative views: democracy, human rights, the rule of law, and we can go back to the Treaty on the European Union to get more details about it. And the European Union, of course, promotes resilience. It's a way to maintain the normative agenda on the one hand, and at the same time to decrease the responsibility of the European Union and to be more pragmatic. And in terms of conceptualization, we have the concept of civilian power, we have the concept of trade power of the European Union, the concept of soft power of the European Union has also been used, and that's civilian power is a form of soft power. And then, of course, there is a concept of normative power and the newly born concept of resilience. This is where we stand in analyzing the EU's normative power. This is the state of the EU's the additional part of the EU's external relations. And this is where I will end our today's lecture. And next time we'll talk more about institutions and instruments of EU's foreign policy engagement.